alright. Let's go. Number 10. The ashfall that erased the people of southern Kyushu around 7,300 years ago on an island chain in what is now southern Japan. A community of hunter-gatherers were living the way their ancestors had lived for thousands of years. They fished the coastal waters. They built pit dwellings. They fired some of the oldest decorated pottery on the planet, cord-marked ceramics that archaeologists would later use to name an entire prehistoric culture after the technique. This was the Jomon world, and on the southern tip of Kyushu, it was thriving. Then the sea north of the island began to bulge. The Kikai caldera, a submarine volcano sitting quietly beneath the ocean, detonated in one of the largest eruptions of the last 10,000 years. The blast is estimated to have released more than 100 cubic kilometers of material, an eruption on the same catastrophic scale as Tambora, the 1815 eruption that darkened skies across the entire planet and triggered what history remembers as the year without a summer. Except this eruption happened in prehistory, with no written accounts, no ships at sea to log the ashfall, no diaries describing the darkness, just the geology, and what the geology shows is almost incomprehensible. Pyroclastic flows, walls of superheated gas, and volcanic debris moving faster than any human being could run, swept across the strait and slammed into southern Kyushu with enough force to scour the landscape down to bare rock. Ash fell for what researchers believe was days, blanketing the region in a suffocating gray shroud that would eventually compact into a layer of volcanic material still visible in the soil today. A layer archaeologists now use as a chronological marker, because it sits so cleanly across the region, like a lid slammed shut on a specific moment in time. Beneath that lid, the archaeological record simply stops. Excavated Jomon settlements across southern Kyushu show dense, continuous occupation right up until the ashfall layer, and then nothing. Not a gradual decline. Not a slow abandonment with artifacts thinning out over generations the way cultures normally fade. An abrupt termination, sealed under pumice and ash, followed by what appears to be centuries of empty land. Researchers studying the pollen records from the affected region have found evidence that the local ecosystem itself needed roughly 1,000 years to recover enough to support the kind of hunting and gathering the Jomon depended on. An entire regional culture, one with its own distinct pottery styles, its own settlement patterns, its own place within the broader Jomon world, did not relocate. It did not merge with neighboring groups in any traceable way. The people of southern Kyushu, by every archaeological measure available, simply stopped being there. What makes this entry particularly unsettling is the scale of erasure involved. This was not a myth passed down about angry gods, or a folktale explaining a bad harvest. This is a hard geological boundary, a physical layer of ash you can put your hand on today, underneath which an entire regional identity goes silent. No burial mounds, no continuity of tool styles, no oral tradition survived to explain what happened, because there was no one left in a position to remember it and pass it forward. The only reason we know the Kikai culture existed at all is that their trash pits and hearths were buried quickly enough and deeply enough to survive as evidence rather than being erased along with the people who left them. The volcano that did this is still there. It is still active. And for 10,000 years before it finally split apart the world of the people living above it, absolutely nothing in the archaeological record suggested it was building toward anything at all. Number 9. The wave that buried Doggerland's edge, around 6200 BCE, off the coast of what is now Norway, a section of the continental shelf roughly the size of Iceland gave way. Geologists call it the Storegga Slide, an underwater landslide of almost inconceivable volume, somewhere in the neighborhood of 3,000 cubic kilometers of sediment collapsing off the shelf edge and thundering down into the deep Norwegian Sea. The collapse displaced an enormous volume of water almost instantly. What that water did next has left a mark on the coastlines of 3 modern countries. The resulting tsunami is estimated to have reached run-up heights of over 20 meters in parts of the Shetland Islands, and it did not strike an empty coastline. It struck a coastline that was, at that moment in prehistory, densely inhabited. This was the era of Doggerland, the vast lowland that connected Britain to continental Europe before rising seas finally swallowed it entirely, and the coastal fringe of that world, along with the shorelines of what is now Scotland and Norway, supported thriving communities of Mesolithic hunter-fisher-gatherers, who depended on exactly the kind of low-lying, reef-rich coastal terrain a tsunami is best at destroying. Archaeologists have found the tsunami deposit itself, a distinct sediment layer packed with marine shells, sand, and debris, sitting directly on top of Mesolithic occupation layers at sites across eastern Scotland. In some locations, the human activity simply ends at that layer. Tools, hearths, and worked bone are found beneath it. Above it, for a significant stretch of time, there is nothing. The wave did not just kill the people standing on the shore that day. It appears to have functionally erased the immediate viability of that coastline as a place to live, stripping soil, drowning freshwater sources with salt, and flattening whatever infrastructure a Mesolithic community would have built up over generations of seasonal returns to a reliable site. The genuinely disturbing part is how little warning there would have been. A landslide 400 kilometers offshore gives a coastal population no visible cause and effect. There would have been no eruption to see, no earthquake violent enough near the coast itself to serve as an obvious signal, simply a receding shoreline followed by a wall of water arriving within a matter of hours. Modeling of the event suggests waves could have struck the coast of eastern Scotland with almost no warning at all for a population with no concept of what a submarine landslide even was. Because the concept of the ocean floor collapsing was not something any human being at that point in history had any framework to imagine. Doggerland itself, the low, marshy plain the wave crossed on its way to Britain, was already shrinking under the pressure of post-glacial sea level rise. Some researchers argue Storega may have been one of the final blows to the remaining high ground of that world, though the region would continue its slow drowning for another 1,000 years beyond the tsunami itself. Either way, the communities living along that particular stretch of coastline on that particular day left behind exactly what a sudden, total erasure leaves behind: a scatter of tools sealed under sand, no burials, no settlement that continues past the sediment line. Just a layer in the earth that marks the last moment before the water arrived. Number 8. The flood that may have written itself into every culture that remembered it sometime around 5600 BCE, according to a hypothesis first proposed by geologists William Ryan and Walter Pittman. The Mediterranean Sea broke through a natural land barrier near what is now the Bosphorus Strait and poured into a freshwater lake basin sitting far below sea level. That lake became the Black Sea. Ryan-Pittman hypothesis, as it has come to be known, proposes that the inflow was catastrophic rather than gradual, a wall of salt water pouring through the breach, at a rate the researchers originally estimated at roughly 200 times the volume of Niagara Falls, submerging enormous stretches of what had been fertile, low-lying lakeshore in a matter of months rather than centuries. The scale being proposed is difficult to hold in the mind. If the catastrophic version of the hypothesis is accurate, the shoreline of the ancient freshwater lake would have retreated inland by as much as a kilometer per day at the height of the inflow, a rate of coastal retreat so fast that any Neolithic farming community settled on that fertile shelf, and the archaeological record suggests these shelves were exactly the kind of well-watered, lowland early farmers preferred, would have had almost no ability to outpace it with anything they could carry. This is the entry on this list most tangled up with mythology. And for good reason. Ryan and Pittman explicitly proposed that a flood of this scale, striking a Neolithic population at the exact geographic crossroads where later Mesopotamian and later still biblical flood narratives would emerge, could be the germinal event behind the flood stories that echo across Sumerian, Babylonian, and Hebrew tradition. It is an enormously appealing idea. A single physical catastrophe curdling into cultural memory and surviving as myth for thousands of years after the actual land it describes had vanished beneath 2,000 feet of water. It is also a hypothesis that a significant portion of the geological community disputes. Subsequent research, including sediment cores that suggest the water level in the Black Sea basin, may already have been closer to the ultimate seawater line than Ryan and Pittman's original model proposed, has produced a genuine, ongoing scientific argument about whether the event was a sudden catastrophe or a slower, still dramatic but less apocalyptic transition playing out over centuries. The debate has not been resolved, and honestly, may never be resolved with the evidence currently available, buried as it is under a body of water that does not give up its secrets easily. What is not disputed is that submerged Neolithic-era shorelines do exist on the floor of the Black Sea, identified through sonar surveys, and confirmed with underwater archaeology. Structures and shell deposits sitting well below the current waterline, in patterns consistent with dry land settlement. Whatever the exact timeline, an entire landscape that people were farming is now underwater, and whoever lived on it left the region, merged into other populations, or did not survive the transition, and did so without leaving behind the kind of continuous record that would let us reconstruct exactly which of those three outcomes actually happened to them. Number 7. The cold snap that nearly ended the Neolithic experiment roughly 200 years ago, give or take a century. Something happened to the flow of meltwater draining out of the collapsing North American ice sheet, and the consequence was one of the sharpest, fastest climate shocks of the entire Holocene epoch. Ice core records from Greenland show temperatures across the North Atlantic region dropping by several degrees Celsius within a span of years rather than generations. A cooling event abrupt enough that climatologists named it simply the 2-kiloyear event, and one that appears to have hit a very specific, very vulnerable population at the worst possible moment in their development. That population was the earliest farming communities of the Near East and Southeastern Europe, people who had only recently, in the arc of deep history, made the transition from foraging to cultivation. Agriculture at this stage was not the resilient, surplus-generating system it would become. Early Neolithic farming was fragile, dependent on predictable rainfall and stable growing seasons, and the archaeological record across the eastern Mediterranean shows a genuine disruption during exactly this window. Settlement surveys in parts of the Near East show site abandonment, population contraction, and in some regions, what looks very much like a temporary reversion toward the older, more flexible hunting and gathering strategies that farming had only recently begun to displace. The most striking case sits in southeastern Europe and Anatolia, where some archaeologists have proposed the cooling and associated drought may have been a driving factor behind a wave of Neolithic migration, entire farming communities picking up and moving in search of land where the rain still fell reliably. If that model is correct, it means an unknown number of the very first agricultural villages in human history, tiny, fragile settlements representing one of the most consequential technological transitions our species ever made, were simply abandoned mid-experiment. Fields plowed and then left to go wild, houses built and then walked away from. Not because of war, not because of internal collapse, but because the climate that made the entire project possible pulled the floor out from under it with almost no warning. The truly unsettling part of the 2-kiloyear event is what it reveals about how thin the margin was. This was not an ice age. It was not even close to the depths of the last glacial maximum. It was a relatively modest, relatively brief cooling episode, over within a few centuries at most, and it was still enough to potentially unravel some of the very first agricultural communities our species ever built. If the transition to farming, the single innovation that everything about subsequent human civilization rests on, nearly buckled under a climate wobble, this comparatively small, it raises an uncomfortable question about how many earlier, less resilient attempts at the same transition may have been tried and failed and left no trace at all. In the centuries before, conditions stabilized long enough for the Neolithic revolution to finally take root and hold. Number 6. The winter that might have been started by a comet at the close of the last ice age, as the planet was warming out of glacial conditions and northern ice sheets were in full retreat, something reversed the process with shocking speed. Around 12,900 years ago, temperatures across much of the northern hemisphere plunged back toward near-glacial conditions in what may have been as little as a decade. An abrupt climatic U-turn geologists call the Younger Dryas, named for a small Arctic wildflower whose pollen suddenly reappears in European sediment layers as the cold returned. The event lasted roughly 2,200 years, an eye blink in geological terms, and an eternity to anyone trying to survive inside it. What triggered it remains one of the most contested questions in quaternary science. The conventional explanation involves a sudden release of glacial meltwater into the North Atlantic, disrupting the ocean circulation patterns that normally carry warmth northward from the tropics, effectively switching off the planet's climate control system. But a competing and far more dramatic hypothesis, the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, proposes that a fragmented comet or asteroid struck or exploded above the North American ice sheet at almost the exact moment the cooling began, and its proponents point to a layer found at dozens of sites across the globe, containing unusually high concentrations of platinum, microscopic diamonds, and melted glass spherules, materials generally associated with high-energy extraterrestrial impacts rather than ordinary climate shifts. The scientific community remains genuinely divided on this, and it is worth being direct about that, rather than presenting the impact hypothesis as settled fact. Numerous research teams have failed to replicate the platinum and microspherule findings at some proposed sites, and the mainstream position still leans toward meltwater disruption as the primary driver. But whichever mechanism triggered it, the consequences on the ground are not in dispute. Across North America, this is the exact window in which the Clovis culture, one of the most widespread and well-documented early human populations on the continent, undergoes an abrupt and still not fully explained disappearance from the archaeological record, their distinctive fluted spear points vanishing from the stratigraphy at almost the same geological moment the cooling begins. And this is also the precise window in which more than 35 genera of North American megafauna, mammoths, giant ground sloths, saber-toothed cats, dire wolves, animals that had survived the entire preceding ice age, go extinct within what appears to be a geological instant. In the Near East, the Younger Dryas struck a population that had, just centuries earlier, begun experimenting with something entirely new. The Natufian culture of the Levant had built some of the first known permanent, sedentary settlements by human hunter-gatherers, communities harvesting wild cereals with such intensity that some archaeologists consider them the direct precursor to agriculture itself. The abrupt return of cold, dry conditions during the Younger Dryas appears to have devastated the wild grain stands the Natufians depended on, and the settlement record shows exactly the kind of stress that scenario would predict. Contracting village sizes, renewed mobility, and a population pushed hard enough by the collapsing environment that many researchers now consider the crisis itself to be one of the direct catalysts that forced the deliberate cultivation of grain, meaning the beginning of agriculture in the Fertile Crescent may be, in the most literal sense, a direct human response to nearly starving during this catastrophe. A civilization-ending event, if the impact hypothesis holds, that may have simultaneously ended one way of human life and forced the birth of an entirely new one on the same stretch of land within the same millennium. Number 5. The eruption that may have nearly ended us all, approximately 74,000 years ago, on the island of Sumatra, the Toba volcano erupted with a force that dwarfs every eruption in recorded human history. Modern estimates place the volume of ejected material somewhere around 2,800 cubic kilometers, an eruption roughly 100 times larger than the 1815 Tambora event, itself already the largest eruption of the last several centuries. Toba's ash has been found in sediment cores and soil layers as far away as the Arabian Sea, the South China Sea, and even Lake Malawi in East Africa. A signature of destruction spread across an entire hemisphere. The scientific debate around Toba centers on what came after the ash finished falling. In 1998, volcanologist Michael Rampino and anthropologist Stanley Ambrose proposed what has become known as the Toba catastrophe hypothesis, suggesting the eruption triggered a volcanic winter severe enough to crash global temperatures for years, devastate plant life across multiple continents, and push the total population of anatomically modern humans, at that point still confined largely to Africa and just beginning to expand outward, down to a bottleneck of possibly as few as a few thousand breeding individuals. The hypothesis draws on genetic studies showing surprisingly low diversity among modern humans relative to other great ape species, diversity low enough, the argument goes, to suggest our entire species may have passed through a population crash sometime in the deep past. If the strongest version of this hypothesis is correct, it means the near-total erasure of every human lineage that has ever existed happened within human memory of Toba's eruption, meaning every person alive today would be descended from the survivors of a bottleneck this event may have caused. That is a genuinely staggering claim, and it deserves the same honesty as the Younger Dryas impact debate above. A growing body of archaeological evidence complicates it substantially. Sites in southern India, sitting directly beneath the Toba ash layer, show continuous stone tool traditions immediately above and below the eruption horizon. Evidence that at least some human and pre-human populations in the immediate vicinity of the eruption were not wiped out and did not even experience a dramatic technological disruption. Some researchers now argue the climatic effects of Toba, while severe, may have been shorter and less globally catastrophic than the original hypothesis proposed, and that the genetic bottleneck visible in the human genome may reflect a slower population squeeze from multiple causes rather than one single volcanic event. What remains true, regardless of which side of that debate proves correct, is this. Somewhere in the deep human past, whether from Toba specifically or from the broader pressures of surviving as a small, scattered population during the last ice age, the number of humans on Earth capable of reproducing dropped low enough to leave a permanent, measurable scar on the DNA of every person alive today. Entire bands, entire regional populations of early modern humans existed during this period and did not survive to leave descendants. We do not know their names because there was no writing. We do not know their numbers because the archaeological record from this deep in the past is achingly sparse. We know only that the genetic diversity that should be there, based on comparison with other great apes who never faced a bottleneck this severe, is not there, a kind of absence written into our own cells, evidence of an erasure so complete it left no bodies behind, only a gap in the code. Number 4. The Green Sahara, that turned its own people into ghosts, for thousands of years, roughly from 11,000 to 5,000 years ago, the Sahara Desert was not a desert at all. Climatologists call this period the African humid period, driven by a subtle wobble in the tilt of the Earth's axis that shifted seasonal monsoon rains far enough north to transform the entire region into a mosaic of grasslands, lakes, rivers, and seasonal wetlands. Rock art discovered deep in the modern desert, at sites like Tassili Niger in Algeria, depicts a world almost impossible to reconcile with the landscape that surrounds those same cliffs today. Herds of cattle, hippopotamuses, crocodiles, human figures swimming, fishing, and herding livestock across a Sahara that supported permanent settlements, and, based on skeletal remains recovered from sites like Gabero in Niger, sustained generations of people through what archaeologists now recognize as one of the most significant and least discussed population centers of the prehistoric world. The transition out of that world was not gentle. Climate modeling suggests the retreat of the monsoon rains happened in pulses rather than a single smooth decline, punctuated by periods of drought, severe enough to force abandonment of entire regions within a human generation, followed by brief returns of wetter conditions that likely drew populations back in before the drying resumed and hardened permanently. By around 5,000 years ago, the humid period had effectively ended across most of the Sahara, and the fertile world depicted in the rock art was gone, replaced by the hyper-arid desert that exists today, one of the most hostile environments on the planet for sustained human life. What happened to the people is where this entry becomes genuinely haunting. Some populations retreated south, following the shrinking band of habitable land toward the Sahel and the Nile Valley, and it is not a coincidence that the desertification of the Sahara lines up closely with the rise of concentrated, complex society along the Nile in the millennia that followed. A plausible case that the pressure of a dying homeland helped push scattered Saharan populations into the dense floodplain settlements that would eventually give rise to Egyptian civilization. But not every group made that journey, and not every settlement had somewhere to go. Archaeological surveys across the central Sahara have identified sites, particularly around ancient lake beds now buried under dunes, that show occupation right up until the drying became severe, and then nothing. No confirmed migration route, no clear absorption into a neighboring culture, just a settlement and then sand, The rock art is the part that stays with people the longest. Thousands of individual images, carved and painted across generations, by people who watched their world change beneath them in real time. Cattle herders depicting the animals their grandparents kept, painted at sites that would eventually sit in the middle of some of the most lifeless terrain on Earth. Whoever made the final generation of that art was standing in a landscape their ancestors would not have recognized, painting a memory of a green world onto rock in a place that was actively, visibly becoming a desert around them, leaving behind the only record that survives of an entire pastoral civilization that the sand eventually swallowed so completely that for centuries afterward, no one looking at the empty Sahara would have believed anyone had ever lived there at all. Number 3. The day the sky stopped protecting anyone. Around 41,000 years ago, Earth's magnetic field did something it has done many times across geological history, but never during the tenure of a species capable of documenting it. The magnetic poles briefly flipped, then flipped back, in an event geologists call the Lachamp excursion, named for the French volcanic site where it was first identified in the paleomagnetic record. During the excursion, the strength of the planet's overall magnetic field is estimated to have collapsed to as little as 5% of its normal intensity, a near-total breakdown of the invisible shield that normally deflects the bulk of cosmic radiation and solar particles away from the surface of the Earth. A 2021 study led by researchers at the University of New South Wales, using ancient kauri trees preserved in New Zealand peat bogs, whose growth rings precisely captured atmospheric radiocarbon levels during the event, reconstructed the environmental consequences in striking detail. With the magnetic field weakened and, during part of the excursion, essentially collapsed, the researchers proposed that dramatically increased levels of ultraviolet and cosmic radiation would have reached the surface of the planet for a period of roughly 1,000 years surrounding the peak of the event. A window the study's authors nicknamed the Adams Transition, after science fiction author Douglas Adams and his fictional number for the meaning of life, in a rare moment of levity attached to a genuinely alarming scientific finding. The proposed consequences are severe. Increased UV exposure at ground level, atmospheric ionization events potentially triggering more frequent auroras at latitudes far outside the polar regions, and, more speculatively, disruption to the ozone layer that would have compounded the radiation problem for anyone living without shelter. The research team specifically raised the possibility that this radiation spike coincides with, and may have contributed pressure to, one of the most significant population transitions in the story of our species. This is the exact window in which Neanderthal populations across Europe, already in decline, finally, disappear from the archaeological record entirely, while anatomically modern humans, who the researchers note show evidence of increased use of ochre, a natural pigment with sun-protective properties, and a documented uptick in the production of tailored, close-fitting clothing right around this period, appear to expand into the same territory. It would be inaccurate to say this hypothesis proves the Lachamp event killed the Neanderthals, and the researchers themselves were careful to frame it as one possible contributing pressure among many rather than a single cause, a piece of a much larger, still unresolved puzzle involving climate, competition, and interbreeding. But the timing is difficult to dismiss entirely. For roughly 1,000 years, the planet's protective shield against the more hostile elements of space essentially failed, at precisely the moment one entire branch of the human family tree, a branch that had survived in Europe for over 300,000 years, weathering ice ages and warm periods and everything in between, finally and permanently disappeared, leaving behind bones, tools, and a small percentage of their DNA still present in nearly every non-African human alive today, but leaving behind no continuous culture, no settlements that persist past this window, nothing that suggests they experience their own ending as anything other than a slow, scattered fading into silence. At almost exactly the moment, the sky briefly stopped doing its job. Number 2. The cold that erased an entire way of being human for roughly 130,000 years. Neanderthals were, by every measure available to us, one of the most successful human species to ever exist. They controlled fire, they buried their dead, in some cases with apparent ceremony. They crafted sophisticated stone tools, hunted massive Ice Age megafauna, and survived repeated glacial cycles across a range stretching from the Atlantic coast of modern Portugal to the mountains of Siberia. And then, somewhere between roughly 40,000 and 35,000 years ago, in a window that overlaps disturbingly closely with both the Lashchamp excursion described above and a series of severe, rapid climate oscillations known as Heinrich events, they vanish from the fossil and archaeological record almost everywhere on Earth, all at once, in a geological blink. The honest scientific answer is that no single cause has been proven, and the genuine, ongoing debate among paleoanthropologists is itself part of what makes this entry so unsettling. Competing hypotheses point to climate volatility severe enough to fragment Neanderthal populations into small, isolated groups too thin to sustain viable breeding numbers. Others point to direct and indirect competition with the expanding population of anatomically modern humans who were arriving in Europe during this exact window with more advanced projectile weapons, wider social networks, and, based on isotopic evidence, a broader and more flexible diet capable of buffering them against exactly the kind of ecological stress that appears to have hit hardest during this period. Genetic evidence confirms interbreeding did occur between the two populations, meaning some Neanderthal lineage does survive, diffused into the modern human genome in small percentages that show up in nearly everyone with ancestry outside sub-Saharan Africa. But that genetic trace is not a continuation. It is a remnant, the way ash in soil is a remnant of a fire. What makes this different from every other entry on this list is the totality of what disappeared alongside the population itself. This was not a single settlement or a single region. This was an entire parallel branch of humanity, with its own tool traditions, its own approach to symbolism and burial, its own 100,000-year relationship with the European landscape, going extinct across an entire continent within a span of time that, geologically speaking, barely registers. No Neanderthal site anywhere on Earth shows continuous occupation past roughly 35,000 years ago. No later culture identifies as a direct continuation of Neanderthal tradition. There was no migration to safety, because there was nowhere left that was safer. The climate stress, the competition, the shrinking population, all of it converged on a species that had outlasted ice ages that should have killed them twice over. And this time, for reasons still not fully agreed upon by the scientists who study it most closely, it did not survive the pressure. An entire species of human being, tool-using, fire-controlling, grief-observing, simply ran out of world. Number 1. Doggerland, the homeland that drowned completely. For most of the period following the last ice age, the land beneath what is now the southern North Sea was not seabed. It was one of the richest, most habitable landscapes in prehistoric Europe, a vast low-lying plain of rivers, marshes, wooded hills, and lagoons connecting Britain to the European mainland, a region archaeologists now call Doggerland, named for the Dogger Bank, the shallow patch of the North Sea that marks its highest surviving ridge. Fishing trawlers working these waters have, for over a century, hauled up the physical evidence of what was lost: mammoth tusks, antler harpoon points, the bones of aurochs, red deer, and wild boar. And in a discovery that turned the region from a curiosity into one of the most significant lost landscapes in human prehistory, in 1931, a trawler called the Colinda dredged up a barbed antler point, a Mesolithic hunting tool, from a lump of peat pulled up 25 miles off the English coast, from a seabed that had, roughly 8,000 years earlier, been dry, wooded, walkable ground. As the last Ice Age glaciers melted, sea levels rose across the entire planet, and Doggerland, sitting low and flat, was ground zero for the consequences. The drowning was not a single event. It was a slow, relentless, multi-thousand-year retreat, the coastline creeping inland year after year after year, generation after generation of Mesolithic families, watching the productive hunting grounds and fishing rivers their grandparents had used slowly disappear beneath brackish, then fully saline, water. Modern seabed surveys, using sonar mapping and coarse samples pulled from the North Sea floor, have reconstructed entire river systems, lake basins, and areas of dense vegetation across this submerged landscape in extraordinary detail, allowing researchers to identify the specific high ground where the last remaining dry land, and very likely the last surviving communities, would have made their final stand against the rising water. Then, roughly 8,200 years ago, the same catastrophic North Atlantic meltwater pulse, implicated in the abrupt cooling event described earlier in this list, may have triggered the final pulse of sea level rise that finished the job the slow drowning had already been doing for millennia. And the Storega tsunami detailed at the start of this list struck this exact region within a similar window, meaning the final chapter of Doggerland's story may have involved not one slow erosion, but a compounding sequence of disasters, landing on a population that had already been retreating for its entire remembered history. What makes Doggerland the most complete erasure on this entire list is not the drama of any single moment. It is the totality of what has been lost, and the near-total absence of any way to recover it. This was not a small settlement or a single valley. Based on the scale of the submerged landscape now mapped beneath the North Sea, researchers estimate Doggerland may have supported thousands of people at its peak, an entire regional population with its own hunting territories, its own seasonal migration routes, its own relationship to rivers and coastlines that no longer exist in any form. And unlike the eruptions and impacts and abrupt climate shocks described everywhere else on this list, each of which left a datable geological signature, a specific horizon in the Earth, marking the moment everything changed. Doggerland's population did not vanish at a single traceable instant. They retreated, generation by generation, off a landscape that is now 60 meters underwater in places, carrying whatever they could carry, into territories in Britain and continental Europe that were already occupied by people living lives similar enough that the refugees from the drowning plane simply, eventually, stopped being distinguishable from everyone around them. There are no ruins to visit. There is no single site where you can stand and see where it happened, because the entire homeland is gone. Sitting under the shipping lanes and wind farms of one of the busiest stretches of water on Earth, its rivers and forests and hunting camps buried under sediment and represented in the entire archaeological record available to modern researchers by scattered artifacts dredged up almost accidentally by fishing boats that had no idea what they were pulling out of the water. An entire world occupied for longer than the whole of recorded human history combined, reduced to antler points in a museum drawer and sonar images of a drowned river delta that no living person will ever be able to walk across. The people of Doggerland did not fail. They did not collapse from war or famine or any failure of their own making. They simply ran out of land, slowly enough that no single generation ever had to fully reckon with the totality of what was happening to them, and completely enough that today, standing on the coast of modern Britain, looking east across the North Sea, there is nothing left to see at all. 10 events. Roughly 70,000 years of prehistory, from a supervolcano that may have nearly ended our species entirely, to a drowned homeland whose rivers now sit 60 meters beneath one of the busiest shipping lanes on the planet. What connects all 10 is not a single mechanism. Some of these people were buried in an instant, sealed under ash and pyroclastic flow with no warning at all. Some had 1,000 years to watch the disaster coming and know where to go regardless. Some may not have vanished so much as they were simply absorbed, their genes diffusing into populations that never wrote down what had been lost. But in every case, the pattern holds. No written record survived to explain, in their own words, what it felt like to watch a homeland disappear. What we have instead is ash layers and sediment cores and antler points dredged from the bottom of the sea, and a gap in the human genome shaped like a bottleneck 70,000 years wide. The civilizations covered in this list did not fail to matter. They mattered enormously to the people who lived inside them. They simply lived before anyone had invented a way to make sure the world would remember them on purpose. And so the world remembers them almost by accident, in fragments pulled up from beneath the ash and the sand and the sea, one dredged relic at a time. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.